Thank you for coming to our Zoom presentation. My name is Elizabeth Tatum. I am the Executive Director of Historic Red Hook, and I'm just going to go through a couple of announcements before I introduce your presenter tonight. So we do have, at Historic Red Hook, we have a couple of upcoming events that I want to make sure our audience is aware of. We have on March 4th, in person at the Elmendorf Inn, we are bringing back our soup night, which many of us are very excited about. We haven't had it since the last one was in the very early winter of 2020. So we're very excited to bring that back. And if you're interested, you can purchase tickets online on our website. Just visit our website at historicredhook.org/upcoming events. Following that, on March 22nd, we have another Zoom talk, and we're excited to bring in Dr. Thomas Summerhill, who will be speaking on his book, Harvest of Dissent, Agrarianism in 19th Century New York. On April 14th, we have a historic tavern trail program at Rose Hill Farm here in Red Hook. So that is actually a program that's being put on by the Dutchess County historian, William Tatum. And that is part of his Dutchess County Tavern Trail series, where he brings different presentations across the county to local food and beverage sites. At that particular event, he'll be talking about the history of Prohibition in Red Hook, looking at a cider company that was actually raided in the 1920s. So if you're interested in that, it is free to attend, and you can find more information on our website. Following that, on April 16th, we have our annual member appreciation night at the Elmendorf Inn. Members will receive some information about how to RSVP for that. And if you're interested in attending and becoming a member, we are always welcoming more people. You can find information on how to become a member on our website as well. Finally, June 3rd, we are excited to announce that we are hosting a festival on the Elmendorf Inn and Green called the Then and Now Festival. This is going to be an indoor-outdoor festival featuring booths and local vendors and focusing on the history of the Red Hook Village and things that have come around, things that have stayed the same. And it should be a very exciting event. So we hope to see you all there. So one final announcement is I just want to thank you all for coming tonight, and thank you for your continual support. Your generosity has allowed us to do free programming like this. So please do consider making a donation today to Historic Red Hook. You can do so on our website at historicredhook.org/general donations. So now I'm going to be passing this over to our presenter today. Dr. Mark Boonshoft is an associate professor, and he at the Virginia Military Institute. He received his BA from SUNY Buffalo and his Ph.D. in early history from Ohio State University. Before arriving at VMI, Boonshoft was a postdoctoral fellow at the New York Public Library, taught at Norwich University in Vermont, and was the executive director of the American Society for 18th-Century Studies. Boonshoft's publications include Aristocratic Education and the Making of the American Republic, which he'll be speaking about tonight. And that was a finalist for a George Washington Book Prize. And also From Property to Education, Public Schooling, Race, and Transformation of Suffrage in the Early National North, which was published in the Journal of the Early Republic and received a 2022 History Education Society Prize. I'm going to be passing this over to Mark. Give me one moment here to stop sharing my screen and give the controls over to Mark.
While I figure out how to do that, let me say my thanks to Elizabeth and Dylan for organizing. All right, there we go. For all of you for being here. Let me see, how do I get this? All right, how do I want this? For everybody for tuning in on a Wednesday night, and it's just a real pleasure to be here. As Elizabeth said, I'm coming to you from the Old Dominion, but as you can see, Bernie Williams over my shoulder. I'm a New Yorker at heart. And so without further ado, so as Elizabeth said, I'm nominally supposed to give a book talk about my first book, Aristocratic Education and the Making of the American Republic, but really it should sort of be like a book talk plus, because I'm going to delve into some of the stuff in that article that Elizabeth mentioned too, partly because it seemed interesting to do, and partly because there's a lot of good New York stuff in there, and since it's a New York audience, I figured why not. So as Elizabeth said, I'm primarily a historian of early America and the early United States, really through the Civil War. But a lot of the questions that animate my work and my teaching are more contemporary. You know, why is education so central to American notions of citizenship, equality, and to the civil rights struggle, right? Another way to put this is like, why is Brown versus Board of Education the most, the sort of Supreme Court case that we all learn about almost first, and why was it sort of the most prominent challenge to segregation and racial inequality in the United States? Why a case about schools? So really, I'm kind of, the research I'm going to talk about was animated by an interest in how educational access became an important component of citizenship, of access to political power in the early United States, but also how the inverse worked, right? How educational inequality and segregation became an important part of attempts to exclude some people from equal citizenship in the earlier United States. But I started this out with a book about really education on sort of the decades surrounding the American Revolution, about 40 years to either side of it, and that was a way to get at some of the issues that I just outlined. All right, there we go. Okay, it's working. I was really trying to understand the politics of education in, as my good friend and the historian Michael Haddam put it to me when he read my manuscript. The weird interlude between a revolution that created a republic and a republic that seemed to require an educated citizenry, and then the much later origins of a public school system that could actually create that citizenry that seems so necessary. So why kind of was there this weird interlude? And the answer is kind of in the title, which is deliberately, at least I thought, kind of jarring, not just hard to pronounce. Aristocratic or hard to say, it's a bit of a mouthful. Aristocratic Education and the Making of the Republic. But why do I think this is jarring? Aristocratic education was a term of art used in the 18th century, but as sort of as a framework for schooling that was prevalent in Europe. In monarchical and aristocratic societies, the assumption was the monarch and the nobility ran things that really only mattered if they were educated, and education was exclusive for completely logical reasons because the political system was exclusive. And that framework for education would seem to have no place in the early American Republic, right? As in a Pulitzer Prize-winning book, the historian Lawrence Kremen wrote that no theme was so universally articulated during the early decades of the United States as the need for self-governing people for universal education. So basically, the need for the antithesis of aristocratic education, right? And the logic here is pretty straightforward. In a republic, if the people ruled themselves, education needed to be inclusive, sort of the inverse, again, of the aristocratic model. Americans after the revolution tended to assume that education needed to transform because the nature of government had, and the success of the revolution, the emergence of a republic that worked depended on that transformation, right? So it was a cliche that education, and ideally public education, was uniquely important in a republic in order to teach the people who were now sovereign the skills necessary for self-government, because self-government is not easy. What I'm getting at, though, in saying this is jarring, is that's not what happens at first. And really what happens is a kind of persistence of older models, of aristocratic models. But first, let me give you a sense for how widespread this faith and this belief in the importance of sort of widespread education for future citizens was. So this is just one example. This is the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution, and right there on the sort of next to the frontispiece is the long article about the need to encourage literature. And by that, they mean public schools, make sure Harvard is well funded, etc. Massachusetts is not alone. There are 4 or 5 other state constitutions that have similar provisions calling for public support of schools. North Carolina wants schools to be established by the legislature, paid for by the public, as may enable them to instruct children at low prices. Pennsylvania, schools should be established in each county. with salaries of the teachers paid by the public so that they can instruct the youth at low prices. Vermont wanted schools established in each town by the legislature to enable them to instruct the youth at low prices. You're starting to get a theme here. Georgia even had a similar provision. On top of this, the Northwest Ordinance, which is passed by Congress in 1787 and essentially lays the framework for turning the old Northwest territories, which become the Northwest, that's sort of the Midwestern states, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin. That has a requirement that every town have public schools. Jefferson proposed a bill that doesn't take shape in Virginia. It doesn't get passed, but he calls for education at the common expense of all. George Washington said, and it's his birthday, so I have to mention him, no duty is more pressing than the common education of a portion of youth from every quarter, right? So on and so on and so on. This is just echoed all across the early republic. You need cheap education for as many people as possible because that's what a Republican government requires. And scholars have echoed this for time immemorial. They love quoting all of these provisions. They love quoting all of the founders who said stuff about this. But then if you look on the ground, these ideas basically never translate into practice for decades. So kind of what's going on? Why the disjuncture between the rhetoric and the reality? So again, the title suggests that what happens is that the old patterns persist for a bit longer than anybody's comfortable with. The title riffs on something Noah Webster, the dictionary guy, said. In 1787, he wrote that a system of education that gives every citizen the knowledge to exercise citizenship and hold office was not desirable, not just desirable, it was actually, quote, the sine qua non of the existence of the American republics. So there you kind of distills all of that thinking into one pretty pithy phrase. But if that's the sine qua non of the existence of the American republics, the problem was that in practice in the United States, while the constitutions, this is another quote, the constitutions are republican, but the laws of education are monarchical. Other people would use aristocratic. My editor wanted aristocratic because it was easier to pronounce than monarchical, but you know, both terms get thrown around at the time. And so in particular, to marshal support for this problem he's seeing, Webster points to the fact that state governments were supporting, and this is another quote, academies where people of property educate their sons, but in which no provision is made for the instructing the poorer rank of people. So I focus the main chunk of the book on that institutional form, the academy. One's pictured on the cover there, about which more in a second, but basically academies were privately run, often created by voluntary associations, but state sanctioned and often state supported schools that we would think of as kind of secondary schools. They were supported and subsidized by the state, but they offered a kind of traditional sort of liberal education that appealed to well-to-do, children of well-to-do people, emphasized the classics, Latin and Greek, so-called polite or ornamental subjects like French, dancing, visual arts, and oratory. They're few and far between. They're expensive to attend, both because of the cost of the education and because often you have to, there's maybe one in a county, so you've got a board. A lot of these become kind of the famous private boarding schools like Phillips Exeter, Philip Andover, and so forth. So one of these academies is depicted on the cover. It's kind of a stately looking building. This one actually still stands. That's the Erasmus Hall Academy in Brooklyn. So the original building stands in the middle of a courtyard of what was for a while Erasmus Hall High School, but I think the name has been changed since. Two more from the period I'm talking about, the 1780s and 1790s in Westchester. The one with the cars in front is the Bedford Academy, the one which is now I think the public library. The one on the other facing it is the North Salem Academy. I think that's the town office building nowadays. So some of these, these were big, stately, costly buildings to build, and some of them stood the test of time. And Webster was right. This is not an isolated incident. They were spreading in number. So this is just the best I could tell, best I could conjure, the number of academies founded in the United States between 1776 and 1800. And I'm giving you the number by state, the number total, and the number per free population in 1800. That may not mean much to you, but I'll give you this another way to think about this in a second. But I mean, the point here is the states are issuing lots of charters of incorporation for academies in particular. They're issuing sometimes direct state funding, sometimes granting lotteries to fund these schools. And there's a decent number of them, but there's still not enough of them to be like a framework for providing universal or even close to universal education. So another way of looking how widespread they were is this. This is from a Washington Post in 2015. It's just a list of the most common road names in the United States. And, so First is not First because a lot of First streets are Park or Front Street or something like that. But in any event, academies, not that high up, but if you kind of see what it's next to, it starts to look a little more impressive. It's almost as many academy streets in the United States as university streets. About half as many academy streets as college or school streets, or maybe, a third. The point being that, you can sort of still see the influence and how widespread this was just on the landscape. If you go through a lot of towns that used to be, that are county seats or something, you'll regularly stumble across an academy street. Okay, so why? That was the question. Why are these spreading? Why is Webster's observation right? Why were when the importance of universal education was becoming a cliche in the United States, why were so many academies that people like Webster thought were aristocratic in nature built at this same moment, right? If they can't produce universal education, and that's the goal at the time, why all this investment? Pretty straightforward problem, which is always a good thing to have when you're writing a dissertation. A good historical question to answer. And the answer I came up with was largely a political one. So what I was finding was that Federalists, which, to rehash, if you haven't seen Hamilton lately, were the political coalition who supported the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, and then during the 1790s, under leadership of people like Hamilton and Washington, were the political party pushing for a stronger central government. They were motivated in part by a belief that in the 1780s, the U.S. was in crisis. Familiarly, we think that the Articles of Confederation were failing, and that was what motivated them, that the central government was too weak. But they were also concerned that too much power was left to state governments, and particularly to state assemblies. And their view of the situation happening at the state level was that in that devolution of power, essentially the wrong people, and putting that in scare quotes, the wrong people were coming into public influence. And it is true that in this period, less wealthy men were getting elected to state legislatures in much greater numbers than they would have been elected to state assemblies in the colonial legislatures. So just a few quotations from some New York Federalists. They distrusted ordinary men and wanted to, quote, displace from the helm characters who carry every mark of civil inferiority and who cannot enjoy the confidence and esteem which the world gives to property and education. They wished instead for a, quote, government administered by the better sort of people who have had something of a liberal education. So they're kind of conflating here people who have a liberal, fancy kind of education with people who have wealth, with the right kind of people to rule. So in other words, kind of well-educated, well-born men should be in control. So what I'm basically suggesting is that what Federalists are worried about is finding a way to kind of rebuild elite power, that is to sort of undo some of the democratization that happens as a result of the revolution. But they have to do that in a way that avoids any notion that they're creating a hereditary aristocracy, which of course is a non-starter in a country that just overthrew hereditary aristocracy. And so what I basically argue in the book is that academies became the institution to kind of make those men to create a ruling class of this better sort, but also to make the case that it was good public policy, that, right, like in a republic, it wasn't that they were well-born, it wasn't that they were wealthy, it's not that they had the right birth, but that they were well-educated. And so that's sort of the motivation, I think, that sits behind a lot of this investment and of both in energy and money in building these academies among voluntary associations. And also the schools then, the academies then kind of put this message out to the public. So this is a map of Morristown, New Jersey, drawn by a young woman at the Morris Academy. And it's just a map of downtown Morristown, New Jersey. And what the arrow is pointing to is the Academy building, which sits pretty close to the center of town. The other buildings that are marked here tend to be like the houses of the wealthy people in the town, the churches, and the county courthouse. So the point being that academies tended to sit at the center of major towns, county seats, and the students would get trotted out at public events, right? July 4th celebrations, you trot out the academy students, right? And you sort of make the case that these are like the future leaders of the republic. Oops, sorry. They put students front and center, kind of trying to convince the public that these well-educated young men should be the kind of people who they eventually vote into public office. And the phrase that's used at these events that the Federalists use in general when they're trying to describe the world they want to see is that they want the United States to be ruled by what they call a natural aristocracy of merit. Right, again, they're trying to distinguish this ruling class from a hereditary aristocracy, trying to say their claims to power are education-based and merit-based, and in that sense, they're sort of taking advantage of the weight placed on education and Republican thinking. And this should all sound kind of familiar to us. It sounds a bit like modern meritocracy, right? Which gets debated all the time. And so it's a kind of important theme in the book that this notion that what academies are doing is producing men of merit, and that becomes a justification for sort of reinstituting inequality is an important theme. So I've got New Jersey up here, but New York was actually one of the more aggressive states besides New Jersey in building academies. Many of you, like me, may have suffered under the tyranny of the New York State Board of Regents test system. I barely passed the second math regents by the skin of my teeth. It was founded in 1784. The regents were founded in 1784 to govern Columbia, which was being transformed from King's College. But in 1787 was given the power to charter, fund, and oversee all the academies in the state of New York. And what you can see here is just if you look at who's on the board of regents, it's pretty much all Federalist. And then there's ministers from every church, ex officio, other ex officio members. But if the ones who are appointed to the board, and you can kind of get their politics, they're pretty much all Federalists. And so again, that's the party that really wants to see this aristocracy of merit kind of take power rather than ordinary people, right? They don't really want farmers. They want educated men who are worldly. Again, I'm saying this all with a hint of sarcasm in my voice because I'm not saying I agree with them. I'm just trying to present what they're thinking. Regents, through the regents, New York invested a pretty large sum of money, relatively speaking, in academies. So from 1792 to 1797, the regents gave £1,500 per year to spend on the state's academies, which maybe doesn't sound like much, but there's only 12 academies. They only serve a few hundred kids. And if you consider that in some of those years, the state didn't spend any money on education for anyone else, a couple bucks per pupil is not insubstantial. So that sort of sets the framework. This is why academies start spreading in this period. It is connected to these broader political issues about who should rule, how power should be justified in a country that has just overthrown hereditary power in the name of all men being created equal, but in which large portions of the population is kind of uncomfortable with that level of democratization. The rest of the book recounts sort of the political mobilization against aristocratic academies and argues that that was actually the reaction against this academy model was what provided the political headwinds behind the movement to finally create strong systems of public elementary schools, what they at the time called common schools, right? So state-supported, accessible, cheap, if not free, elementary education available to all boys and girls, though often all meant white. So these often end up being pretty segregated, and that's sort of where I'll end the talk later. What critics were claiming about academies, part of what their argument against academies is that they weren't actually doing anything all that different than creating a traditional aristocracy, and that there was nothing particularly meritocratic about it. It wasn't rewarding merit. What was really happening, they would argue, is that children of well-to-do parents who could afford to send their kids to get an advanced classical education in a private academy, often including boarding out of their own home, were doing so in states that had basically no public elementary level schools. And then those kids who went to the academies were being touted by their community as future leaders because of their education, which again was totally inaccessible to most people. So the argument is basically that all academies were doing was laundering the privilege of already well-to-do kids. And that argument gained steam in the mid-1790s in New York in particular, but also kind of throughout the Mid-Atlantic and New England. So in 1795, New York Governor George Clinton, who was a Republican, an opponent of the Federalists, gets kind of fed up, and he gives his annual address to the legislature, and he criticizes academies, which are, as he puts it, principally confined to the children of the opulent, and complains that a great proportion of the community is excluded. He pledged instead to support, quote, the establishment of common schools throughout the states. Right? On the one hand, you've got these academies that are arguing serve an elite, and on the other hand, you've got the promise of these common schools that might be able to serve a much broader base of the population. So in 1795, the state appropriated £20,000 per year for 5 years, so £100,000 total for common schools. Meaningful, but insufficient. Per school and per pupil, this was about 10 to 20% of what academies received. That original appropriation from 1792 is still on the books. So again, that is to say, poorer kids in the state of New York are getting about 10 or 20% of what richer kids are getting in terms of state support for their education. And then New York didn't renew the funding when it expired in 1800. So this is an important experiment, meaningful, insufficient. Things changed more permanently in the 1800s, largely, or some historians argue largely, because of this guy Jedediah Peck. Peck was born in Connecticut, 1748. Like a lot of New England men, he ended up settling in central New York during the early Republic, and he was he landed in Otsego County near Cooperstown. And Peck's kind of hobby horse was education. He wanted to, quote, bring improvement within the reach and power of the humblest citizen, and he thought that common schools were the way to do that, not academies. Because, as he put it, in all countries where education is confined to a few people, which he thought academies were, a system based on academies confined education to a few people, in those contexts, we always find arbitrary government and abject slavery. So Peck is really successful at making education a prominent political issue in the period, in that the first decade of the 19th century. When New York State assembly elections, gubernatorial elections often turned, at least in part, on people's positions on education. It would regularly pit supporters of academies against supporters of common schools. And the Republican Party, the Jeffersonian Republican Party, sort of pick up Peck's mantle and make universal state-funded common schools a priority. And also that meant undercutting academies. So in the 1807 gubernatorial election, one essayist, Republican essayist, put it in pretty clear terms, I think. Ignorance and slavery afford the richest soil for rearing federal plants, that is, Federalists. But republicanism is the spontaneous production of education and independence. Those who wish for destruction of the common school fund, which is developing, and for the advancement of Tories into office should vote for the Federalists. But should you wish your children educated, rally around the Republican standard. And the Republicans win that election. So it's, in New York, a pretty central political issue. And by 1812, the war is essentially won. This is the kind of from the state legislative journals of that year, but the legislature calls a commission to organize a common school system for New York State. And if you look at and that commission issues a report, the first name on that commissioners is Jedediah Peck. And he's the lead author. It's pretty clear he's quoting himself in this report. He literally quotes newspaper essays he wrote 15 years earlier, which is kind of bonkers. But the report makes two essential arguments. This is a lot of text. Sorry, you don't need to read along, and it's probably too small on your screen anyway. But the report makes two arguments. It criticized academies for being, quote, partial in their effects, right? And in other words, they couldn't reach everyone, and that was ultimately the necessary goal of education in a republic. And then here's where Peck quotes himself. The solution was, quote, the establishment of common schools being spread throughout the state and aided by its bounty, tax dollars. Doing that will, quote, bring improvement within the reach and power of the humblest citizen. So really 13 years later, he takes directly from a newspaper essay he wrote in 1799 and drops it in a piece of New York State, essentially what will become legislation. In a state and a country where political equality is established and where the road to preferment is open to all, he writes, tax-supported, democratically controlled public schools that could sort of make universal education a reality was necessary, because that was the recipe to create governance by an equal and informed citizenry. And so New York adopts this plan in 1812. Tax-supported common schools become mandatory at the town level 2 years later in 1814. And so, in other words, it's through this education policy, through the overthrow of supposedly aristocratic academies and the prioritization of common schools, that the state finally thinks it's actually going to create democratic self-government in New York State. And it's also in the wake of this, and I can talk more about this in the Q&A if people are interested, but academies also change as a result of this. They cease to kind of be the aristocratic schools that they once were, because all of a sudden, huge numbers of people now have access to the basic levels of education, which create all sorts of incentives to change the sort of secondary-ish model that academies were filling in for. So that's kind of where the book ends. But like I said, this is sort of like a book talk plus. So where I think this leads to a kind of interesting story about the origins of democracy in the North more generally, and really like what that article that Elizabeth mentioned and what I'm going to talk about here shows is kind of what I think of as the effects of the transformation in education policy that I trace in the book. And at a basic level, what I argue in that article, and what I'm going to suggest today, is that what happens with the schools in New York and elsewhere, right? So this happens in New York pretty clearly in the 1810s, and it slowly works in similar ways throughout the North in the same period. This really did change the constitutional basis of democracy in the northern United States. So what you're seeing here is a chart. Every northern state minus the Midwest. The middle column is the year in which those states adopted constitutional support for public schooling, and the further column is the year in which that state, eliminated property qualifications for the vote. So prior to the Revolution, in most colonies, one needed to own a certain amount of property in order to vote. Most states kept those property qualifications after the Revolution. The idea here is that voting is like a privilege, not a right. It should only be conferred upon those who have a stake in society. But as it becomes increasingly backward to many Americans to base a privilege on wealth and inherited wealth, it just seems outmoded. Nevertheless, the idea that voting was a privilege was kind of hard to shake. And so as momentum grew among ordinary white men to kind of eliminate property qualifications, there's many states called constitutional conventions in the 1810s and the 1820s, at which changes to these voting laws are on the books. And the point I'm making with this chart is that not a single northern state eliminated property qualifications without first at least laying some groundwork for public schools, right? In other words, the transformation I describe in the book is the necessary precondition for the democratization of the North. It is the justification for why it is now possible in the North to expand access to the ballot. Works totally differently in the South, where they basically drop property qualifications without providing public schools, but that has a lot to do with slavery. And I'll get to the ways that this Northern story impacts the South at the very, very end. But New York, again, offers a great example of how this goes down. So in 1821, New York has a constitutional convention. Part of the agenda of that convention is to get rid of New York's property qualifications, which were steeper than most states and had been on the books since the 1777 Constitution was originally adopted. There were many people in the convention, people like James Kent, who was the leading jurist in the state, who opposed getting rid of the property qualifications. He thought that voting should remain a privilege. But it's the recent expansion of education in New York that is used to kind of challenge and ultimately those people's position, and really to assuage the fears of kind of conservative New Yorkers who didn't want to see the property qualifications disappear. So the top quotation here from David Buell: virtue and intelligence are the true basis on which every Republican government must rest. Education is the only sure means of establishing those pillars of freedom. And he had no apprehension, therefore, in confiding suffrage to the great mass of New Yorkers, because they were now all getting access to education, right? Schooling was widespread enough to expand access to the vote. You could rest assured that even non-wealthy, non-property owning men in New York would be informed and therefore capable citizens. Now, to get to the negative side of the story, the segregation side, right? In that same convention, New York takes away what had been equal voting rights for African Americans. All right, they could vote so long as they met, up to this point, so long as they met the same property qualifications that were put on white men. And instead, New York increases the property qualifications on African Americans and basically disfranchises most Black voters in that moment. And again, education is part of the justification here. This is Jonas Platt. Most of the free Negroes in our state are unfit to be entrusted with the right of suffrage because they lack sufficient intelligence, right? Now, I think this argument is utter hooey, malarkey, to use Joe Biden's phrase. Black New Yorkers had fought tooth and nail to get education. Per capita, I think they actually spend more effort and money than white New Yorkers, but it didn't matter. New York takes away the voting rights of Black New Yorkers by increasing the property qualifications and justifying it as necessary because they weren't sufficiently educated to properly and responsibly exercise the franchise. And this is something that's pretty common throughout the North. They rarely in the North make this a legal qualification. They don't say if you can't read, you can't vote. They use they'll either sometimes explicitly racialize the suffrage, like in Pennsylvania, they say Black people can't vote. Or in New York, they'll put a different property qualification on Black men, but they'll justify it as necessary because of the lack of education, the sort of perception that they could draw on that African Americans were not educated or were not educatable. And this is seen as increasingly desirable by a lot of racist folks in the North, because this is the period when more and more African Americans are gaining their freedom. So in New York, gradual abolition essentially comes to mostly an end in 1827, a couple years after this. So the number of free African Americans in the state is exploding at the very time they start disfranchising them. Black activists see what's going on. Again, they had been prioritizing education from the antebellum period on because they understood how important education was to making claims on the vote. And they continue that process in the 1820s and the 1830s. The Colored American is the second Black-run newspaper in New York. The inaugural issue makes pretty clear their undertaking: we shall advocate for universal suffrages and universal education. Right? They're in that framework where you can't imagine one without the other. Another issue of that newspaper, an early issue, there's an essay that makes the argument that emancipation from slavery does not confer the right of suffrage, but Black men would be able to claim the franchise, quote, as soon as they possess qualifications required of other citizens, which they would prove by intellectual culture. And so they redouble their efforts to build schools, to get Black children access to the common schools that states are implementing throughout the North. And the result is a white backlash. Predictably, so you've got in places where schools are segregated and African Americans are building separate schools for themselves, you get white mobs tearing them down, burning them down. There's an example in New Hampshire where they chain a bunch of oxen up to a school, literally rip it off the foundation and carry it out of town. The public schools, many states start intentionally excluding African Americans, right? So this is both of these cartoons are from an anti-slavery publication in 1839, but right, you've got the white schoolmaster keeping the Black children from entering. And this breeds a whole lot of frustration among African Americans activists who are basically like, we're doing what white Americans did and we are being treated differently, right? In other words, we are trying our damnedest to get education. In many cases, we are actually getting our children educated, and yet still we are being denied equality and citizenship. This is another essay from the Colored American. Whenever Black children attempt to, quote, clutch these advantages, that is, of education, the omnipresent genie of epidermisal, as skin, distinction waves its magic wand. Presto, they are excluded. And by this, we are deprived of the right of suffrage on the score of general ignorance. Right? Even though Vogelsang knows that, right, in New York, it's actually a property qualification that excludes New Yorkers. The justification he recognizes is that they are not educated. And New Yorkers are deliberately keeping them from school so that they can maintain that justification. That link between unequal schooling and disenfranchisement cements between the 1830s and the 1850s, such that you end up with this. But between the 1830s and the 1850s, New York, Delaware, New Jersey, Connecticut, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois, all condone segregation. Ohio and Pennsylvania actually mandate it in the 1840s and 1850s. And so by the Civil War, every northern state that legalized school segregation had unequal and racialized suffrage laws by 1860. And all of the essentially New England states, which had either outlawed or just never really had segregated schools, did not have racialized suffrage. That is, where people could go to school equally, they could vote equally. Where they couldn't go to school together and equally, they didn't vote on equal terms. Again, even through this point, almost none of these states institute literacy tests. There's not like an actual test. This is just the justification. This is just a pattern. But it's worth mentioning that Massachusetts and Connecticut are the first states in the Union to mess with literacy tests, which they do basically to disenfranchise Catholic immigrants in the 1850s. New York, in its 1846 Constitutional Convention, actually considers adopting a literacy test, but says it's kind of unnecessary. The work has already been done. This story has important national implications. The 15th Amendment is passed after the Civil War. I know I'm moving through time pretty quickly here, but it's passed after the Civil War to guarantee voting rights to the recently freed enslaved people of the South, right? And it says the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be infringed or shall not be denied or abridged by the U.S. or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This leaves gigantic loopholes, right? You can't discriminate. You can't take away the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It doesn't say you can't take it away on other accounts. And Northerners knew that there would be giant loopholes and that perhaps literacy or perceptions of inadequate education could justify disenfranchisement. They had been doing that for, decades at this point. And they defend that loophole. So here's a New Hampshire senator. To deny suffrage on account of race or color or want of property is to do violence to the civilization of our age and to insult Christianity. But to protect the franchise and guard it against floods of ignorant barbarism simply preserves the jewel of liberty, right? So they know literacy and education standards might actually disenfranchise a lot of people, and they're good with it. They keep that loophole in deliberately, right? And so we know that ends up being the mode that the Jim Crow South uses. Literacy tests, education tests become a pretty key way of denying African Americans in the South the right to vote. So that's the kind of national story. There's also a New York story to this. We tend to think of the 15th Amendment as meant to bring the South in line with the North in terms of racial equality. But right, it's also important to remember that New York still had these property qualifications that disenfranchise large numbers of Black voters. And so the 15th Amendment actually changes the story in New York. So there are referenda in the state to guarantee Black suffrage. They don't pass. You can see here it gets closer to passing. But New York rejects this 3 different times. But after the 15th Amendment is approved by Congress in 1870, New York's Republican-controlled state legislature ratifies the 15th Amendment, which you'd think would be the end of the story, except the Democrats take power and they try to rescind the ratification. That's disallowed. It's this whole convoluted thing. But ultimately, the 15th Amendment, which is, again, we think of reconstructing the South, leads New York to amend its constitution and its laws to provide for equal suffrage for men, regardless of race, to eliminate those differential property qualifications in 1872. And critically, in 1873, the state passes the Civil Rights Act that provides for equal civil rights regardless of race, and basically disincentivizes school segregation and requires equal funding of schools, right? So in other words, voting rights still and education still had to go together. So New York is forced to remove the racialized voting, so they remove a lot of the racialized barriers to equal education, right? The story had come full circle. In 1821, the state enacted a suffrage regime that enfranchised basically all white men and disenfranchised all black men, ostensibly on the basis of who or who was not educated. And when the federal government forces it to adopt equal suffrage, it wastes very little time in at least nominally providing for for legal equality in schools. And this, again, has humongous implications for the national story. This becomes this notion of unequal schooling being a justification for unequal voting is paramount in the Jim Crow South. In large measure, Northerners are kind of okay with it because they see this as a rational justification. Unequal schooling can go with unequal voting. And in fact, New York gets in on the game again, and in 1921 adopts a literacy and education test, largely to target immigrants. But again, the point being that, right, education and voting still goes together in their heads as the Jim Crow South takes shape. And all of this logic, I think, rests on this sort of earlier story about how you get from unequal to equal education and how that helps to create democracy in the first place. So I will stop it there and happily take as many and all questions as anyone has. And let me stop sharing my screen so we can see everybody.
Thank you. That was excellent. I'll be opening it up to questions from everybody. If you want to either type your questions in the chat, I can voice them. I can also unmute one by one. I do want to just start off by thanking you again, and thank you also for including the information from your article. I think it makes your presentation really rich, and especially, it's important for Black History Month to be looking at these subjects. So I had a question just to tie this in a little bit to our local history in Red Hook. Our secretary of the board at Historic Red Hook and also the head of our collections committee, Claudine Close, she's here tonight. She recently just put together an article about the Upper Red Hook Academy, which was founded here in Red Hook in 1822. So in Red Hook, the public school system was set in place in 1813, which is just a year after what you were showing us about that report on public education, and also a year after Red Hook became a town. So they set up 9 different school districts. But as Claudine mentions in this article, it only went up to, I believe, 8th grade. So the Red Hook Academy was an option that would provide further education. And my question to you is, how do you see institutions like the Red Hook Academy in 1822 fitting into the narrative that you talked about tonight?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and it's a perfect example. There's sort of the second generation of academies, right? Once the state has a pretty broadly accessible public school system, the purposes of what we would think of as secondary education change, right? It's now just the next step in a process, as opposed to the thing available only to wealthy people. And so what you see in the 1820s throughout New York State is that even some of these earlier academies start to change, right? Like, so basically, like if you look at the curriculum of academies in New York from 1780 to 1820, it's basically static. Classics, French, dancing, fencing, painting, etc. And then like 1820 rolls around, and that's after the first generation of kids have kind of gone through these new public schools. And all of a sudden you start seeing this explosion of subjects, sciences, different kinds of math, all sorts of history curriculum. The number of subjects, I can't, it's somewhere in the book, I like detail this, but like it 2 or 3 times as many subjects are being offered in academies. Academies open in huge numbers in the 1820s and the 1830s, serving a whole bunch of functions, creating, training people for middle-class jobs, training teachers. That's a huge deal. All these common schools that the state is now requiring need people to teach at them. And so women start going to these academies in huge numbers to get the training so that they can go into the common schools to teach. And so the entire purpose of academies just shifts on a dime in New York in and around 1820, and throughout much of the North too in that period. And so a lot of these academies end up becoming high schools as high schools become more common in the 1840s and the 1850s. I went to the high school I went to in Westchester was a union-free school district, which is harkens back to an 1850s law that allows common school districts essentially to turn academies into high schools, so they can have secondary education outside of the control of the Board of Regents, which had hitherto been the only game in town for that. So some of these academies, stick to their guns and remain these kind of elite bastions. In Massachusetts, some famous examples are Phillips Andover, places like that, or in New Hampshire, Phillips Exeter. But in a lot of places like New York, and I would assume the Red Hook Academy fits this, though I haven't done research in that collection, it becomes this more middle class, accessible institution designed to serve the kind of changing needs of the society. This is a great question, and I look forward to seeing where this goes, this project.
Thank you. We have a couple other questions, so I'm going to pick some out here. Bill Wilkin asks, what role was played by churches in promoting literacy in the late 18th and early 19th century?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, the original, purpose of public schools in the colonial period in New England, where in Massachusetts there are requirements to have local town schools that teach the 3 R's. True of most of New England. They're called old deluder Satan laws, right? You have to be able to read in order to read the Bible, so that way you don't get swayed by people who would steer you to the dark side. And so churches are at the forefront of education in the 17th century New England and 18th century New England. And then in New York and in much of the and really much of the country in this period, what ends up happening is that churches and ministers are hugely important in mobilizing kind of communities behind schools. But at the same time, the reality sets in that in a republic, to divide children by denomination is to divide the body politic. And so they have to kind of put aside sectarian differences in certain measure and work together. So there's a couple of academies in New York that illustrate this point. There's one called the Union Hall Academy. I think it's in Queens. And the Union is the union. It's like the minister of the Dutch Reformed Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Episcopal Church, and so on down the line, uniting together to form this academy. And so they're putting some of that sectarianism aside. Whereas in the colonial period, actually the sort of first academies to open in the U.S. or what becomes the United States are basically there to train young American men in a certain denominational tradition before they go off to college to be ordained as ministers. So there's a huge shift. Churches maintain a role, but the educational outcomes, or so the religious outcomes and goals of schools shift kind of pretty starkly in the 19th century.
Great, thank you. We've got a couple other questions here. John Vincent's asking about, I think, universities like Virginia Jefferson School and Harvard, and just wondering if there's any connection in your research about the development of university systems.
Yeah, so the idea again of those, Harvard had always claimed what it was doing was training the next generation of leaders for Massachusetts, and so it functions essentially like a state university. It's written into the Massachusetts Constitution, and so in places like Massachusetts, where they're envisioning, even in the Constitution, a system of public education, then the hope is that by having that broad base at the bottom, you can actually create this kind of meritocratic system where ordinary people can rise to the top, go to Harvard, and become leaders. The problem in Massachusetts is it's still not really affordable. Jefferson's plan for Virginia was originally that that there would be a tiered system of public schools. You'd have these broad base of common schools. In the middle would be something like an academy, into which the best children of in each town, the best poor children from each town who couldn't otherwise afford to go to the academies would get a scholarship, and then the best of the children who couldn't afford to pay their own way, who excelled in the academies, would then go to UVA. And so there's an idea of kind of building this tiered system. Jefferson's goal is to make it accessible through kind of state funding and scholarships. It just never he doesn't get his wish. He gets UVA, but he doesn't get the public school system at the bottom. So that he privileges UVA over that.
Right. It sounds like we could pick your brain all night and you have a great answer. I'm going to pick one more question just so we don't go over the hour limit. So someone's asked generally about, they've asked about looking for resources in Dutchess County on early academies, and maybe we can broaden that out to like, what type of evidence were you using in your research, or do you have any suggestions?
You can get the New York State Board of Regents minutes on microfilm you can buy them for like $60 for a copy of the microfilm from the state archives. They're pretty hard to read, and at a certain point in like the 1800s they become so faded you actually can't read them. So there's that for New York. Newspapers, though, the way I tracked academies throughout the country was newspaper advertisements, and that's sort of the best way to do it. You can see schools that become academies forming before they're chartered by the state and before they have a legal existence that you can find in official records, and you can find other things that are competing with them, that are opening and offering similar or different types of education at the same time. So that's really the newspapers are the money source.
Cool. Yeah, I'll make a plug here. Historic Red Hook does have some digitized newspaper archives that are available. If you go to our website, we have the Red Hook Journal and the Red Hook Advertiser. So they cover the 19th century and early 20th century. If you're looking for broadly, Dutchess County, the Poughkeepsie Journal is America's oldest newspaper and is available through newspapers.com. Historic Red Hook does have a subscription. So if you come to the archives and make an appointment, you can use our subscription to search through newspapers.com. Thank you. So I'm going to save some of these questions here just because we didn't get to all of them, just for future reference. But thank you all for the questions you did ask. And thank you, Mark, for being such a great presenter.
Thanks everyone for coming. I really appreciate it. Oh, and yeah, and you can feel free to email me. You can find me on the internet and just email me the questions if you're so inclined.
Great. Thank you so much. Everyone, I hope you all have a good night. And here in Red Hook, it's snowing. So I hope you all enjoy this snowy day tomorrow.